saga begins.
Are we ready? Okay.
It's for the noise reduction.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Cory,
And I'm Isaac.
And I'm Leslie.
and we're here to talk about movies. We have a special guest today, a local Seattle writer like Isaac and me, sort of. Her name is Leslie Cogley. She is my sister. Say hi.
Hi.
Do you want-
Sister and twin. Sister and twin.
Do you want to say anything else as your intro before we go into this?
I guess I consider myself a Star Wars fan. I'll just put it that way. So that's why I'm here.
Yes, that is why we brought her, because she is a Star Wars fan, and Isaac and I hate Star Wars. So, yeah.
No, we don't.
We don't hate Star Wars. As you read by the title, we're going to talk about Star Wars today. If you're listening to this, you've probably seen what's it called? Rise of Skywalker.
Great start. We're very well versed on the material. Yeah, that little movie that just came out recently.
Yes. Right now, where does it stand, Isaac, in terms of box office compared to episodes 7 and 8?
It's doing well. Last I checked, it is more or less matching The Last Jedi beat for beat in terms of how much it's made. It started out a little slower, but it's proved a bit leggier. I might be like a week behind on the box office ratings, but it's successful. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, shocking. Yeah, I wonder if the slow start had anything to do with the initial critic outcry about the movie, because it has, as of now, very similar reviews to the original, or not the original, the prequel trilogy, which were pretty much critically panned.
Maybe so, but the thing is there really anyone who wasn't going to see this movie because of the critic reviews?
No,
on one hand, you
definitely
have
not.
the hardcore Star Wars fans who were going to see it no matter what. And on the other hand, you have the casual audience looking for fun Christmas time viewing who sees the Star Wars brand. Neither of those groups is going to decide not to buy a movie ticket for the most part because the critics gave it 54% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Definitely. I mean, it's on Disney Plus. It's owned by Disney. It's basically a family event now, and putting it around the Christmas time is probably not an accident.
I think you're right. A lot of people just were going to go because I think that there was a lot of people who just wanted it to end at this point. I feel like there's a lot of people who were kind of bitter towards it. Maybe some hardcore fans who were just kind of like ready to see it end. But I think that there was like some surprising peace at the end of the movie. At least that's what I've been hearing.
Yeah, I also got that sense if we're going to jump into talking about the Rise of Skywalker.
Sure, we can start with that. I think it's a natural place to start. A lot has already been spoken about it, but we have our own things to say.
Yes. I don't know where most people lie on the ending, spoiler alert, but judging by the general internet community consensus that I've got, it's a little panned, but also accepted by the fans as like a good enough closing of the series. I don't know, Leslie, as a Star Wars fan, what do you think?
Well, back to what I was just saying, I think what Star Wars has become is almost a little tiresome at this point in this last go-round with the final 3 movies. But at the same time, I think that the ending served its maybe only purpose at this point, which was to wrap up what they kind of opened, a Pandora's box, if you will, in terms of starting with episode 7 and then taking us on this ride through episode 9. It was a lot different for sure.
Well, I guess it started out the same, where we had
Yeah.
episode 7, which, mirrored the original Star Wars in a lot of ways. And then the trilogy took fans on a path that was revealed to be pretty much unplanned, right? They were just figuring it out movie to movie, filmmaker to filmmaker. So we had, of course, Rian Johnson's extremely divisive film, The Last Jedi, which we already talked about a bit in our previous podcast episode on Rian Johnson and Knives Out. And then we had JJ come back for The Rise of Skywalker and do what he did to it.
Maybe we can start by digging into this, wanting it to end bit a little bit. Going into The Force Awakens and coming out of it, even knowing that it was pretty much a ripoff of Star Wars or A New Hope, it was easily the most enjoyable experience, I felt like. And I think it's because I was the least disillusioned by it at that point. it didn't seem like Star Wars was tied into this crowd-pleasing market research type scenario. Nothing had come out right by then that I know of anyway about the so-called toxic fan base that is associated with the hateful image that's tied now to The Last Jedi for some people. And so, as time went on, going through the rest of the 5 movies, by The Rise of Skywalker, I was almost viewing it from a completely removed point that I didn't think I would be at. You know, by then, it was so far removed from my childhood joy that I even was still holding on to as a non-child, seeing The Force Awakens, that it became this kind of abstract blend of like nostalgia and removal from actually what I would consider a good film. And weirdly enough, I actually enjoyed it, even though I think it was one of the worst of the new ones, just because it so clearly and purposefully tied up all of the things that needed to be tied up. Even if it was in no way original or unique, it just felt like enough thematically tied to the rest of it and made me kind of realize how, you know, they were all kind of bad in the first place. They're all sequels and all inferior in their own way. I don't want to say as inherent as sequels are, but that's where I was at seeing this.
So our question is, what is Star Wars? And your initial answer after seeing The Rise of Skywalker is that Star Wars is an endless barrage of the same thing over and over again, and it is maybe over-cherished. You're maybe pinpointing...
It might be. I think that's just what fans want to see. And I am accepting that as also being a fan, that it ended up, I guess, being what I wanted to see, right? Instead of taking it in a new direction or something, it appealed to the fan base. And even though fundamentally I think that is odd and probably wrong, it worked. And it seems like a lot of fans are agreeing with that sentiment, that it worked to appeal to them, even if it did so shamelessly. Let's hear a different viewpoint on that, I think. Isaac, you are more in the camp of disliking, especially of the ending and how it wrapped up. So can we go in that direction a little bit also?
Sure. I definitely have my problems with The Rise of Skywalker, and I think, again, so much has been spoken of it at this point that I don't know if I want to dive too deep into how I felt about the ending.
Mm-hmm.
My overarching sentiment of the movie was that it was rushed, overstuffed with plot, thematically disappointing, and undid a lot of what made its predecessor, The Last Jedi, interesting. I agree with that evaluation of it, which has been shared a lot. So there's my, in a nutshell, take on The Rise of Skywalker. But I want to actually respond to a point that you made about how it seems that the fans want this sort of comfort food version of Star Wars as opposed to the uncomfortable version of Star Wars that was proposed by The Last Jedi. I don't know if that's an accurate statement, considering that what we're talking about here is this vocal minority of Star Wars fans who were enraged enough by the decisions made in The Last Jedi to, you know, do things like review bomb Rotten Tomatoes and engage in really disgusting hate speech on Twitter against Kelly Marie Tran. I'm not saying everyone that disliked The Last Jedi did those things, but, you know, the most vocal minority that disliked The Last Jedi did all of those things, whereas the masses that went to see it and made it a $1.2 billion grossing movie that had made, at this point, more than The Rise of Skywalker has made, they still enjoyed it a lot. I heard you guys talking about this before I came in, but their cinema score evaluations that, you know, the immediate leaving the theater consensus from the general audiences when The Last Jedi came out was that they were just about as pleased with it as they were with The Force Awakens and every prior Star Wars film. So we got to be careful when we're making generalizations about like what people want, because I think what it really comes down to is what the corporate behemoth Disney and the powers that be think audiences want. And what the Rise of Skywalker is, I think, is the safest possible version of the 9th Star Wars movie. The one designed to please the people who are most likely to vocally cry out against it, and do so with the knowledge that the rest of the movie-going general audience isn't really going to care that much, whether Star Wars bucks the trend or not.
I think it's pessimistic and probably overgeneralization. You're right, what I was saying. At the same time, like, I think the main disillusionment is seeing the design. Even, like, before just kind of seeing it as an allusion or an homage to the original trilogy that, you know, was trying to separate itself from the prequels and the general consensus on that. I think the main disillusion was just seeing that design that you were describing, and I think it is pessimistic, and I think there's plenty of people that don't see it as a designed film, just as one that is trying to go back to the basics, maybe trying to go back to what Star Wars is about. And that's why I think our question is very interesting, asking what these Star Wars movies will leave as their legacy.
Kind of speaking to that, I think for me, what I've been sitting here mulling over while you guys have been talking is...
Talking is putting it lightly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was taking it in. What I think the answer to what is Star Wars or what has it become is it's just successful. It's really just a force to be reckoned with. Pun intended. No, but really, it is this very, like, vastly popular and successful franchise, considering there's been so many prequels and sequels and other movies added. I mean, you just said, 5 in the last 4 years? Yeah. And that's without me even adding in my own personal opinion of them. I think that it is just known at this point, if you look at the box offices, if you look at the ratings, it's just widely successful. But I will add to that, I think that it's on the verge of being played out, which I think happens a lot with large franchises. And until episode 7 happened and came up, everyone, or at least I'll say the general everyone lightly, was really excited to actually see the Force awaken, in a sense, like, from its sleep, I guess you could say, because it had been on pause for so long, that there was kind of this initial, like, excitement that happened. And I think in a way that kind of slipped out once episode 8 happened, and then even now once episode 9 happened, there was almost this downhill from that initial excitement. I mean, how could there not be, I guess? But I think that's interesting to think about what happened in the last 3 movies versus kind of the whole arch of, like, the Star Wars saga. I feel like if I'm going to water it down just to do this, nothing really happened in episode 8 if you just looked at it on a very large, faraway scale. It was just kind of a really long chase scene. And I know that we could get into it, but I think for me what happened was, when I initially saw episode 7 and was really enchanted by the idea that Star Wars was back, it almost felt, and this is a terrible way to put it, but nevertheless, I'm going to say it anyways, I feel like what happened was, it's like when you are a kid and, like, people tell you that Santa's not real and, like, the Band-Aid is, like, ripped off, and then you're kind of just sitting there like, I don't even know, like, what to think anymore. I was ready at the end of episode 9 to let it go. And kind of what Cory had said before, I was almost detached from it at that point. Not that I didn't care how it ended, but that I was ready to settle on whatever they chose to settle on.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction when The Last Jedi first came out. Although I did really like it, I still felt like there was this kind of dampening of that pure joy and excitement that The Force Awakens cultivated, right? The Last Jedi was, like, sobering by comparison, even though it was still an effects-driven blockbuster. The Last Jedi was that for a lot of people, and The Rise of Skywalker was seen as a course correction to it. And what I am wondering is, would Star Wars be able to go down either of those routes and remain as successful as it currently is? Like, are we maybe over exaggerating the degree to which the general public consumes these movies? It kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, like, Star Wars is going to make money because it's Star Wars. And answering the question of like, what is Star Wars? Well, Star Wars is just a tremendously popular media property that like the likes of which have pretty much never been seen before. Beyond that, it can be multiple different things.
I think I see kind of where you're going with this, talking about whether we can view Star Wars or anything as something more than, because it is both a collection of images on a screen, right? Just movies, and also something more, right? A giant cultural phenomenon. So you're asking where people sit in their viewpoints of that, right? Whether you can even reckon with the idea that it is something greater, because it is, right? It's something greater than just a collection of movies, because otherwise I don't think it would be as big as it is. But at the same time, it is also just movies, right?
I guess kind of thinking about what you were saying, at least a certain amount of people, I think they want to believe that maybe it's over now, but I don't really think that it's ever really over, because if you look at the arcs of the original trilogy and then the prequels and then now this last go around with these last three, I guess I'll equate it very loosely to how I feel about like the Marvel universe, which is they just keep making Marvel movies, and at a certain point I don't even watch them because there's so many that I'm almost lost in this chasm, which is like the Marvel universe. I think right now where Star Wars sits is it's vastly successful and it's popular and it's a cultural phenomenon, yes. But I think it's on the verge of, if they do decide to continue making Star Wars, whatever that looks like, another 3 movies or just more one-off smaller things, I think it's on the verge of becoming that sort of an entity that there's so many that how am I going to watch all of them? How am I going to keep track of all of them?
Yeah, and in fact, I think that the reason why people flock to these movies is in large part because they are events, right? Every Star Wars movie so far has to an extent been this must-see event. The Force Awakens was the return of the franchise, and The Last Jedi had, you know, all of the momentum of the cliffhanger ending from The Force Awakens, and then The Rise of Skywalker has the claim of being like the last entry in the whole franchise, even if, like you just said, it's probably not going to be. Ultimately, what brings people to movies is not the promise of the same thing again. It's the chance to witness something that is completely one of a kind, right? That is totally unprecedented. That's what made Avatar the highest grossing film of all time. That's what powered the Harry Potter franchise to its tremendous heights, right? Was like the opportunity to see this beloved literary saga depicted on the big screen with an unprecedented degree of like trueness to its source material coupled with actual good filmmaking. That's what made the Marvel movies and the Marvel universe so huge, is the fact that it is this unprecedented, interconnected universe, even though now it has become, you know, relatively predictable. The things that bring people back to those movies aren't the fact that they get to see, you know, such and such hero beat up such and such villain in basically the same way for the 20th time. It's the feeling of getting to see something brand new, whether it's like the first team-up movie like the Avengers, or the big climactic battle against the ultimate bad guy that's like never gonna be, you know, the scale's never gonna be this high again, Infinity War and Endgame. Like, you know, people come to those movies because of their uniqueness, even if that sounds contradictory, because they are such corporate products. And I think that the same is true of Star Wars. Each Star Wars movie that has come out so far, every single one, has had some claim to that vital, one-of-a-kind eventness that powers movies to immense box office success.
Where do you think the last entry stands? Because I think Leslie and I kind of mentioned it already, where we think it kind of sits in terms of like people's viewpoint on the last one. Where do you think it sits in terms of why it drew viewers towards it? Like, do you think in your general understanding of people talking about it, critics and fans alike on the internet, or just people you've talked to, where do you think people sit with their opinions on The Rise of Skywalker?
Well, are you asking me why I think it was so successful, like financially, or why?
Yeah, or if you think it wasn't successful in fans' opinions or in people's opinions. What's your general consensus on it? Maybe slightly tied into your own experience, because I mean that's really all you can draw from, or if you think you can like extrapolate a further.
I don't know. I mean, I think it makes complete sense that it's been as divisive as it has been, because it really does symbolize the fundamental divide in terms of what franchise filmmaking should be. Right?
Yeah.
Like, should it take risks and challenge people's long-held nostalgic bits that are deep inside of them, or should it just please fans, tie up narrative loose ends, and meet expectations, basically? It's got about 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, so critics are pretty split on that. I've talked to people who have felt both ways about The Rise of Skywalker. So I think that the reaction to it gets at the fact that either of these routes is viable in terms of like pleasing some subset of the people who are going to go and see these movies. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, which of those groups is more important to please? Like, do you please the people who liked The Last Jedi, or do you please the people who liked The Force Awakens, I guess, for its, staying true to basically copying beat for beat A New Hope?
I think it's interesting also thinking about, it depends on who you're asking, in the sense of, if you think about the Star Wars fan base, that could mean like a 7-year-old kid, or a 23-year-old, or like a 60-year-old. And so I think it's worth noting that if you went and did maybe like a sampling of all of those different age groups, I think you would probably see, or maybe it would highlight some of the reasons why it's so divisive at this point. Maybe not. I don't know, because I haven't gone out and done that. But I think it's interesting because just like all of those other, well, not exactly like all of those other franchises, but in a similar way, like it reaches a very large demographic of people.
Most of the demographics that you just mentioned do not have the kinds of strong feelings about the Star Wars mythos that the, vocal minority opposed to The Last Jedi had. Most people who go in and watch Star Wars are pleased by what they see, and have been for every movie in the series so far, right? That's why the movies keep making so much money at the box office.
So it's hard to make that claim without like overgeneralizing, but I think you're right. I think from box office alone, it is clear that people are going to see it and wanting to go to see it.
Right. And the 7-year-old who went into The Last Jedi in a Luke Skywalker outfit isn't going to come out of the movie all like jaded and disillusioned and existentially terrified because of what does it mean that Luke is now a disgruntled old man. Like, no, he just thought it was cool that Luke stood down Kylo Ren in the salt flats, right? Like, there's too much concern paid to the kinds of strong reactions that big fans of the series, myself included, have to these movies, and that ultimately this franchise could go in either direction in terms of the fan pleasing or the convention bucking, probably still be immensely successful. And so that's why I find it so maddening and disappointing that the direction that it's taken has been the safe route, because I really honestly think that Rian Johnson's vision of big changes to the way blockbuster stories are told, despite it leaving people dissatisfied, it was an equally viable strategy for telling big budget stories and having them make just as much money as the safer route is. But because it carries with it that risk of igniting the fervor of a small group of hardcore fans, the corporate interests decide to go with the safer bet. Even though I guess what I'm arguing here is I don't even think it really matters in terms of Star Wars long-term success as a franchise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think important word to highlight there is disappointed. And I assume other people are feeling that way as well. It's like we can see both sides of it almost, where the critics and a fair amount of, like you said, the ones that aren't extreme in their reaction are okay with it being taken in a new direction, right? And that's, harkening back to the original trilogy. That is basically what The Empire Strikes Back did. It took what was a very standard hero's journey arc in the first movie and just took it in a new direction. Star Wars, the first film, had ended, so to speak, right? It had a beginning and ending, a heroic journey for Luke Skywalker, and you didn't know where The Empire Strikes Back was going to take it. That's honestly what The Last Jedi did. And I think however you stand on it, you can't deny that it took it in a new direction.
And then again there, the Return of the Jedi came and did something somewhat similar to what Rise of Skywalker did, although not to nearly as extreme an extent, but it definitely had a tonal correction from The Empire Strikes Back, and a lot more focus on the fan service elements, like infamously the Ewoks, who were basically there to sell merchandise, and the overall more standard structure of that narrative. So this isn't the first time that we've seen Star Wars veer off in a unexpected direction and then course correct for a finale.
I remember talking to our old film teacher, Mr. Woodard, about this too. I have a vivid memory of him talking at Return of the Jedi about how he perceived people to take it, because obviously we didn't live through its coming out in 1983. So hearing it from someone who had seen it at the time, seeing everyone despise the last one because it did exactly what you said, right? It kind of course corrected, it seemed like, and focused a lot on the visual elements in order to sell merchandise, and was highlighting the same word, disappointing, as an ending, even though it wrapped up the whole thing thematically, which is what I feel like the Rise of Skywalker did also, right? It wraps up the ending thematically.
The difference, I think, is that Return of the Jedi thematically was at least made sense in terms of what The Empire Strikes Back had already set up in the first two like that trilogy was still conceived by George Lucas,
right? Planned as a
right?
Trio, yeah.
Whereas the Rise of Skywalker, I agree that what it did was similar, but I think that it took it a whole order of magnitude more extreme in terms of the fact that it, literally altered plot points that had been established in The Last Jedi in order to change the themes that you walked away with, in order to reinforce the ideas of like tradition and family ties and power resting in these basically royal bloodlines. And it did away with the more interesting themes that had been established in The Last Jedi in favor of just resorting back to these themes that Star Wars has already tackled before in 2 trilogies.
And I want to bring up an interesting article that Isaac showed me by Eliana Doctorman that talked about pretty much how the Rise of Skywalker negates purposefully everything that happened in The Last Jedi.
It does. Very relevant to what we're talking about, so we'll give a link.
Well, I'll have to go read it. But to that point, I think that we need to zoom out a tiny bit and just also think about, if you're looking at the Star Wars story in the last 3 movies, there are a lot of divisive things that happens in terms of like the negating of episode 8 and whatnot. But also, let's zoom out further to like the way that this trilogy was even constructed, which you've already identified, was, sort of similar, but also sort of completely different than the original trilogy in the sense that it wasn't conjoined as like an original like idea for a trilogy. And it's so clear when you watch the arc of these last 3, because it was like J.J. Abrams, and then it was Rian Johnson, and then it was J.J. Abrams again. So I think, unfortunately, what happens is Rian Johnson just kind of gets like shit on in this instance, because if, hypothetically it had gone in a different direction and like a different third director would have taken over episode 9, maybe we wouldn't feel this way. But because it went back to J.J. Abrams, it seems like it makes sense that it almost inevitably would have gone back against what happened in episode 8, unfortunately. Yeah. That's just kind of what was going to happen.
And I think the fact that Disney handed the reins back to J.J. Abrams for the 9th episode is a resounding statement. It's basically Disney saying, what is Star Wars? Star Wars is ours. Like, that's what's right. I mean, I think if they could go back, they would have the trilogy pre-planned by J.J. Abrams and probably would have given him the reins for all 3, right? Mm-hmm. There was an initial intention to make these movies stand on their own, right? And to give each director their own vision, more or less. And I don't think that that's going to happen anymore.
Probably not.
I don't think that that's what Star Wars is going to be going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. And I guess to sum up, like, what I feel like we've talked about throughout the whole first part of this podcast is like, I think at this point, anyone who basically was disappointed or hoped that episode 9 would be different needs to not be so heated about it because of all of the factors we've mentioned. It's like, at this point, if you look at all of the pieces together, there really was no way you could have expected anything more than what you got. And I think that's what I've ended up settling on, is like exactly what happened in episode 9 is basically, in hindsight, exactly what I could have expected or hoped for in the movie. Like, I don't know that they would have taken it in any other direction if you really weigh all of the factors.
Yeah, to go off of that, I also felt, even with a general disappointment about all of them, the disillusionment, even with that, I was primarily satisfied by what happened, even if not really the execution. I was satisfied by what they did at the end of the movie, because I actually really enjoyed the kind of the Rey's chosen family element at the end, even though it was super obvious and pretty much like a blatant tie-in to the rest. Like you said, I can't really imagine seeing it tied together any other way. And the fact that it was thrown in that she's related to Emperor Palpatine, Darth Sidious, it seems cheap. And even though it was not even remotely alluded to in the first two entries, 7 and 8, the final tie-up of Rey's chosen family and Kylo Ren becoming good because of his lineage and, relation to that, that's why I maintain that it's thematically good enough, right? It worked for what it was trying to do, and what it was trying to do was just like bring it back, and the execution of it was not perfect, and it's definitely cinematically one of the worst of the 5 last movies they made, but it's like you said, I can't see it going another way.
The overarching sentiment is that The Rise of Skywalker was good enough, and that's evidenced by the fact that, again, it's continuing to make the same amount of money, and it isn't enraging most people that go and see it. I think that there's a problem with being okay with good enough, though, and I think that, especially given that The Last Jedi proved that you can make a highly successful, acclaimed, and even generally liked blockbuster while eschewing all of those predictable ways of telling a story and refusing to do basically exactly what the Star Wars franchise has already been doing for 7 movies before it. That was a huge run-on sentence, but basically The Last Jedi showed that that was possible, and then The Rise of Skywalker showed that also it's very possible to not do that. I don't think that either of those approaches should be over-sensationalized as the only viable approach. I think that both of them are viable approaches to blockbuster filmmaking. And so as film goers, it would be neat if we could at least get behind preferring the less predictable approach. I just don't think that, like, it is as hopeless as you make it out to be. I think that we really only saw... We saw one
really pessimistic.
Yeah, I guess so. But we saw a sharp turn, and then we saw a course correction. And yes, we've seen that before in another Star Wars trilogy. But that's not a huge sample size. Like, we can still imagine a world in which blockbusters are interesting movies too. In fact, we're kind of living in that world.
I feel like I'm inclined to agree with you to an extent. I think that there is a hypothetical world where we can hope that that happens, and maybe this is just me leaning on the pessimistic side, but I'd like to think it's more on the realistic side, which is, I don't know if realistically we should expect that Star Wars takes that risky turn, and I think that's kind of what I mean with the sentiment that I gave.
Yeah.
But I think what I would be interested in discussing is the prequels, which I know that we have not even mentioned at this point, but I think it's interesting because with this last 3, I don't think it's seasoned yet enough to really, we can think about what it might be, but I'm interested to talk about maybe the prequels because they're newer than the original trilogy, and talk about, well, what are they in the world of Star Wars, and what have they become?
Yeah, maybe we can get closer to actually answering the question that we posed if we examine where Star Wars has been before.
My initial thoughts about the prequels, because I feel like we've drawn a parallel between this last trilogy and the original trilogy, and I feel like a lot of people bring that up when discussing Star Wars, but I feel like the prequels are this special, this might not be the right word since they're prequels, but they're this special intermission between, like, the movies, if you're looking at the timeline in order of, like, years that they were created. And I know people say a lot of bad things about them because maybe they're poorly made and they're from the early 2000s when everyone was, like, really psyched about CGI. But I think that I've come to appreciate them more as time has gone on. And I'm not necessarily sure if I have an answer for why, but I think it's worth discussing what you guys think.
It's because they came out when we were children.
Part of it's that. I think part of it is rose-tinted goggles. But I think that the prequels, they're from a different era. And in fact, they're kind of the epitome of a visionary having total creative control over a multi-million-dollar blockbuster. In fact, 3 of them. And because of that, I actually think that those 3 movies are a lot weirder and in some ways like more interesting than some of the newer Star Wars films.
Yeah, and I was honestly hoping that you would say that because of just what you were saying before about should cinema be about creativity and risk-taking and films as like an isolated own thing, like should films be evaluated standalone? I know that's something that I feel like both of you have brought up before, but I feel like the prequels are this really interesting addition to the original trilogy because you have the actual big narrative of Star Wars in the original trilogy that everyone was really stoked about, but then you have the prequels where nothing really that new happens because you know all of the big spoilers of Star Wars at this point, right? Like, you know, Luke, you know, and Darth Vader, and then Leia and Luke, and you have all of these big tropey moments in the original trilogy, and then the prequels somehow are still like pretty successful at what they do without having any of those reveals. And my question is why?
Well, initially because there was more Star Wars, right, when they first came out. And I think that that's why they continue to be successful again, is that Star Wars had this legacy built up around it. People would go out to the movies to see anything with Star Wars on the posters. That's the easy answer.
Yeah, it was a gap of, 16, 17 years from Return of the Jedi, so it was so mythologized by that point. I mean, there had been so much extra universe creating after Return of the Jedi came out, right? With people writing offshoot novels and really trying to dig into the backstories of Han Solo and Boba Fett, which were 2 of the most beloved characters to expound upon outside of the movies. So I think you're right. I think the thirst for more Star Wars was there. Right. But at the same time, now that we've gone that distance since the first prequels came out, it's kind of the same thing almost, that they're just part of the legacy and they're a shared cultural moment that so many people joined in on.
Yeah, and despite their way a lot of people feel about them, which is mixed.
Yes, divisive at best.
Yeah, they didn't kill enthusiasm for Star Wars, right? If anything, they ignited it more, made Star Wars relevant again, and powered its relevance through that 10-year gap between Revenge of the Sith and The Force Awakens.
And I think we can judge what Disney is doing based on their remakes of their old movies alone. They want to update these legacies that these movies have for a new generation and continue, what they started with people decades ago.
But at the same time, I could never see the prequel trilogy getting made the way it is if it had the kind of corporate oversight that
definitely
Star Wars probably has now. I mean, those movies, obviously, horrendous dialogue, super ugly CGI, the pacing is all off, there are horrible performances everywhere, and annoying characters abound. But they're actually pretty interesting movies, right? Like, The Phantom Menace is such a oddball film that is sort of only tangentially related to the rest of the trilogy, right? So much so that some people drop it from their viewing order when they're going back over the whole series. The prequels introduce all these like trade dispute drama that is ultimately really not important, but nonetheless a lot of time is devoted to it, and it is boring. But it is unusual. George Lucas put that stuff in there because George Lucas wanted to put that stuff in there, and it was maybe not the right decision in terms of making a good movie, but it was certainly an unusual decision, right? Star Wars was different than we had seen it before.
It wasn't necessarily completely the wrong decision because I guess, like, even though they don't have extremely high reviews on places like Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb, recently I went back and rewatched them and had like a new appreciation for them, especially after seeing these last 3 movies. This even ties back to a point that you, Isaac, made earlier, is that I kind of was liking that there was somehow a strange parallel between young Anakin Skywalker being kind of this kid who came from nothing and is destined for greatness in some way, shape, or form, and the parallel between that and Rey, who seemed in the beginning of the new trilogy to be this girl who came from nothing, and it didn't matter that she kind of came from nothing or had no connections to any bloodlines because she was just maybe destined for greatness. And so I think that it's vastly disappointing if we look at it that way to then view episode 9 and see that they've created this tie-in where she's related to Emperor Palpatine. Though interesting in a fan-based perspective, I think it is really disappointing because there was something to be said about that in the end maybe it didn't matter who her family was, and that's why she has this chosen family and whatnot.
Yeah, that was one interesting point of that Time article that Isaac sent me also, that Rian Johnson really leaned into the fact that because Rey was basically a nobody, that anyone could be a Jedi, right? It's not just legacy, bloodline, destiny. There's something else at work, and there's a great shot at the end with the kid looking up at the stars and having, like, didn't he have, like, some kind of Jedi force powers at the end? Yeah, they, like, show that because it's the final point that she's starting something new, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's not about people's bloodlines.
So I guess, yeah, to that extent, I think that's why, now that time has gone on, I mean, The Phantom Menace is now 21, almost 21 years old, I guess. It came out in 1999. I think that's why the prequels were so interesting now in hindsight, because they did kind of have that awe-inspiring story of, like, you know, rags to riches, perhaps, in a very convoluted way. I mean,
basically Annie.
Yeah, but I mean, basically also, you know, the big twist of, like...
Annie. I just wanted to say that for the mic, that his name is Annie in the movie.
Great. I'm really glad you made that point. But I think that even though it's kind of this, you know, what you think is like, wow, anyone can achieve greatness, and then there's the big turn of him going to the dark side, I guess. I still think that, like, in the new 3 movies, they had an opportunity to go sort of a route like that with, like, an awe-inspiring story of, you know, rising up, and I think that aided to the disappointment in hindsight after rewatching the prequels and kind of seeing how they did it once before.
They definitely, I think, tried to at least tie it in, though, at the end. They made Rey a Skywalker, so to speak.
Well, but
which I think has got some dispute. I guess I don't know exactly why she would just claim to be a Skywalker, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe there's some element of, like, you know, anyone can be a Skywalker. Like, it's not about.
Yeah, there was
really,
something trying. There was something trying to happen there, and I'm
like,
not sure what it was.
I'm not sure either. But if anything, it shows that she comes from, like, the other most powerful bloodline in the galaxy. So it's not really saying that anyone can be a Skywalker.
Oh, definitely, yeah, definitely not.
Whereas I like what you said, Leslie, about how, you know, Anakin really does come from nothing. And as goofy as that whole Immaculate Conception, like, Jesus parallel is in The Phantom Menace, it does extend the possibilities of the Star Wars universe, right? Like, it introduces the idea of this totally random occurrence happening to this nobody, and it, alongside that, the prequels, like, expand the universe in other ways, right? They introduce a lot of new worlds and species and, like, droids, for one, and also just don't focus at all on pre-introduced characters from the original trilogy, with the one exception being Obi-Wan.
I would argue, though, that Rey is equally a nobody as Anakin Skywalker is, because if you're going into The Phantom Menace, you know how much baggage Anakin Skywalker's name has on it, and maybe that was what they were trying to go for in the Rise of Skywalker, even if that wasn't a planned thing until the end, right? That she was tied into some bloodline at all. There was the same attempt that they did with Anakin Skywalker to make Rey a nobody with destiny. You see what I mean at all?
Well, yeah, but I think that to that point, what I was saying is that initially, because the new 3 movies weren't a trilogy, like, they had an opportunity where, yes, she did start out as what seemed like a nobody, and there was that parallel between the Phantom Menace and, you know, the prequels and her timeline, even continuing into episode 8. You know, you guys were saying they really played on that in episode 8, but then by the end, that's just like completely deconstructed by the tie-in of her being related to Palpatine, who was the other most powerful bloodline. And then they kind of tried to bandage that up by saying, oh, but like, it doesn't matter that she was like related to one of the most powerful evils in the world, because she can choose to be good and she can choose to be a Skywalker if she wants to, which kind of throws it completely off course from any parallel that could have been made about those movies and the prequels.
But since Anakin is the progenitor of that bloodline, wouldn't you say he's not a nobody then? Like, or at least equally a nobody to Rey?
Well, I'm just saying that he comes from nothing, right? There's no one above him, basically. Which, in the case...
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. I'm just thinking in terms of the film arc reveal, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the narrative arc. I'm more talking about purely, like, expanding the possibilities of what Star Wars can be. Like, I think there's an argument that the prequel trilogy, weirdly enough, even though it has this inevitability and you know where it's going, kind of succeeds in expanding the possibilities and insinuating maybe that the Skywalker saga is just one of many, right? Whereas the sequel trilogy, because of the way it ties Rey's character into the rest and then ultimately has her choose to be a Skywalker, almost has the effect of closing off future possibilities and of making this statement that, like, this saga is over, which of course was the goal of it, but, like, not only is this story over, but this was the story all along, right? Like, it wasn't about the possibility of a nobody to cause all of this everything. It was...
I think it just depends on how you look at it, whether you are looking at it from the true chronology of the Star Wars saga, right? Starting with Episode 1 that came out in 1999, or if you're starting it with Star Wars, A New Hope.
Yeah.
If you're starting it at Star Wars, you're viewing it as the original trilogy, right? The original story that goes along with that, the establishing of this bloodline, Anakin Skywalker, Luke Skywalker, Leia, and then going to the prequel trilogy that takes that same bloodline and expands it, or, you know, expands the story of it. What I was trying to go with that, and maybe it's just devil's advocate or just, like, you know, trying to play the pessimistic view of it, is that they're all equally bad and inessential compared to the original trilogy.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Like, I brought this up to Leslie when we both saw it together, that they're all just sequels and all kind of bad. What maybe my viewpoint is, I don't know where I stand on it for sure, but maybe part of the viewpoint is that the worst, quote-unquote, episodes have trouble attaching themselves to that original trilogy thematically. And when I say worst, I don't actually think that these two are the worst, but the ones that attach themselves the least to the original trilogy thematically, I think, would be Rogue One and The Last Jedi, because they're trying to do something different narratively. And all of the rest of them are kind of medium because they are just thematically trying to do the same thing, right? Just trying to continue off the original,
Yeah, as
ride
opposed
on the
to branching
coattails,
somewhere new.
not branching anywhere new.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see what you're saying. I think that makes sense the way you've depicted it. But also, I want to go back to something Isaac had mentioned, which is in episode 9, the kind of grounding that is attempted to happen with bringing the sequel trilogy more rooted into, like, the Star Wars universe by connecting Rey to Palpatine as if that was the story all along. I think effectively what happens when they did that was, rather than like grounding this movie or this trilogy more so into the Star Wars universe, they trapped it and chained it too much into the Star Wars universe and did kind of,
Or
and
into
it
the
had,
Skywalker,
yeah,
like-
and it had kind of a limiting effect to it. And so while I think, Cory, you do have a good point in saying like a lot of the movies, minus the two you mentioned, Rogue One and The Last Jedi, they are kind of this lukewarm idea of like connected to Star Wars enough that you're okay with it. I think that in episode 9, it was overkill though. And it kind of ruined it for me because they like shoved so much of what you know to be Star Wars into the plot line that it almost was like, oh, well, that's too much. I don't necessarily like that happened because now I feel like you've put a roof on it.
Yeah, and that's why I think the question like what is Star Wars, or it doesn't have to just be the kind of endless barrage of sequels that you're describing, Cory. We've seen it be other things, right? We've actually seen highly successful iterations of Star Wars like The Mandalorian and Rogue One, although that is connected, you know, narratively, like it has the tie-in. It seems at this point that there is interest in the broader Star Wars universe. Like Star Wars is not just this one story that was told over the course of these 9 movies. It's going to be other things in the future, probably, right? There's going to be other movies that are unconnected from the Skywalker saga, and there's going to be other Star Wars related properties that are immensely successful and have nothing to do with the whole saga of the Skywalkers. So maybe the ideology behind the Rise of Skywalker was like, all right, well, this is one last hurrah for just the Skywalker part of Star Wars, so like we'll just make it all about that.
I could see that.
I could kind of see that as being the rationale for doing what they did. It's just, I again come back to the fact that I find it disappointing that we had to tarnish what was, oh goddamn, I just really love The Last Jedi. And it would have just been the way that The Last Jedi grapples with the Skywalker legacy maybe could have been fulfilled in a really interesting way in a sequel to that movie, but instead we just went back to this sort of insular Skywalker story that had been told in all the other movies. So I don't think that Star Wars is doomed to keep doing that over and over again.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it probably can. Like, I think that people will start rolling their eyes if we keep on introducing new Skywalkers, you know, as the protagonists of every Star Wars movie series in the future. So I don't think that will happen.
I think that leads us into maybe like a good next point, which is, where do you guys think it could go from here? Like, do you think that they will bring back Rey and, you know, Poe and all of the characters from this series that they've just now, this last trilogy they've created, similar to how they've brought back old characters from the original trilogy, or not? Like, are they going to continue going in that direction, or are they going to start anew?
I think Isaac's sentiment is the most hopeful on that they do take it in a new direction, and I think people are ready for that now, as shown by The Last Jedi going into The Rise of Skywalker, that they can do something new and it can be equally successful. So I guess the last thing to talk about is probably just what this specific trilogy will be remembered as. And that I leave open as well as Leslie's question.
It's very hard to say. Yeah. It's completely unprecedented in a lot of ways. Like, there's never been a media property like Star Wars before Star Wars. So maybe 30 years down the line, there's going to be like a revival of this trilogy, and we'll get old Rey teaching some new young Jedi the same old tricks.
But I hope not, right?
But I hope not, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if anyone can really say what this trilogy will be looked back on as, but
yeah, I think what I said earlier about it is it hasn't seasoned itself yet. Like, it's too new to really know. I mean, we can speculate, I guess, but I would like to think, to Isaac's point, that maybe they will, you know, take it in a new direction and just leave what's been in the past in the past.
The thing is, though, there's a difference between taking it in a new direction in terms of like fleshing out the Star Wars universe and focusing on new characters and storylines, and actually having those new characters and storylines be interesting and unconventional in and of themselves. Maybe superficially Star Wars is going to change going forward, but I didn't mean to sound overly optimistic about how I thought those stories would go. I don't necessarily envision a future where Star Wars is like boldly forging new storytelling paths and like creating new ways to make blockbusters and stuff.
No, I think that I got that from what you were saying, but I just think that it's interesting that I don't think any of us really know, because I think they've taken us for a ride, I mean, successfully speaking, like this far, I mean, with the prequels and now with the sequel trilogy. So it's kind of almost like an opportunity in itself to like see what they do after this.
I mean, an astounding number of people have watched all 11 movies bearing the Star Wars title. So it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen because, like you said, Isaac, there's nothing like it.
It's hard to define Star Wars because it really is a one-of-a-kind thing, at least right now. We were talking about this last night. The cinematic medium is like still pretty young, and Star Wars was the first of its kind. Like, it truly was the first blockbuster franchise starter.
The
of
original
its scale.
trilogy.
The original trilogy, yeah. That makes it just so hard to think about 30 years out. Like, if I had to guess, I don't think that this new trilogy will be looked at in the same way at all as the original trilogy. And
I don't think any other franchise has exactly the same or will ever have exactly the same idea. They might try, but
it'll be interesting if the Marvel universe has some kind. I mean, that will have an immense amount of nostalgic. I mean, it'll be something that a lot of adults 30 years from now hold very near and dear to their hearts, right?
Well, I think, and also just going back to what I think, Isaac, you'd said before briefly, is that Star Wars in and of itself has, up to this point, been an event also. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how much time passes before they resurrect it again, if they in fact do, which I think that they will. But noting that we've kind of observed up until this point that it is in itself an event to go see the new Star Wars movies as these trilogies, it'll be interesting to see if they continue to ride on that, because it seems like yes, but I don't know.
I think I pointed this out, Leslie, to you, that the original wait from original trilogy to prequel was about 16 years, and then the wait between prequel trilogy and the new trilogy was about 8 years. So they're just going to keep having it every time. So the next one's going to come in 4 years.
You're probably not that far off, considering, we're not talking about the weird, nerdy visionary who still owns his own property anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, now this is in the hands of
Corporate
Disney, which is
conglomerate.
now itself an unprecedentedly enormous monolith of a movie-making studio. Right? We could talk about that for a while.
I mean, I think the fear, at least for me, is that, like I mentioned way back in the beginning, is that they'll just start pumping out movies and it will get old really quickly. And so I hope they don't do that, but it's definitely a possibility if you look at the Marvel franchise and maybe other franchises that are similar.
Mm-hmm. It's maybe impossible to answer that initial question that we said, what is Star Wars? Because it's a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But if we had to, after discussing all of them at least a little bit, what would you guys say? Cory, what is Star Wars?
I don't know.
All right, we have one I don't know.
I think it is a cultural phenomenon that is more than just a set of movies, right? It's a shared cultural experience, like I mentioned earlier. I don't know. It's hard to say where that will go from here, but that's where I'll leave it, is that it is something that is shared by a exorbitant amount of people and will continue to be that way because we can't unexperience it. We'll always all have that experience. Many of us will have that experience.
I think I agree for the most part. I think I feel that that is what Star Wars is, if you boil it down to the bare essentials. I also think that, and in a lot of ways, maybe this is how a lot of fan-driven franchises are, but I also think that it creates this following that is kind of like, in a way, the thing that drives and carries it, other than if you take it out of the box office and corporate side. I think that if the movies stopped, I don't think that Star Wars fans and Star Wars like fan bases would go away. And so I think that in a way it created kind of like you said, it's like this cultural phenomenon, but also it's kind of like this self-contained fan base that will kind of live on forever in a way.
I like that dichotomy that you draw there, right? You can either define Star Wars in terms of what is up on the screen or on your computer screen now or wherever you're watching or playing or buying toys that are Star Wars related, or you can view Star Wars as being this kind of shared cultural experience. Like you can focus on the people. Like you can kind of say Star Wars is like this bond that people have, right? You can go up to a stranger and start talking about Star Wars and they'll probably, even if they don't even go to movies, ever have an opinion on it. Like our friend Abe,
Yeah,
who
exactly.
just the other night,
Yeah.
right? Like had a pretty strong opinion about The Last Jedi.
Yeah, a person who claims to not know anything about movies.
And he really doesn't know very much.
And
He
doesn't.
hasn't-
Yeah.
Ha, throwing shade on Abe, but he's not going to listen to this. But Star Wars is both of those things. To Disney, it's a brand. But no matter what Disney does with that brand going forward, that cultural identity that people share, that shared experience isn't going to go away. But it definitely, I think that the cultural experience part of it might rest more solely, especially with some time.
Okay.
I think that there will at some point be a clear dividing line that you can draw, and I don't know where that dividing line is yet because I don't think we have enough perspective, but like you'll be able to look back and say up until this point Star Wars was sort of this like transcendent property that brought everyone together more or less. And then after that Star Wars became like just another brand. Not every Star Wars movie that comes out in the future is going to be the kind of event that The Force Awakens was, or that The Phantom Menace was, or even that The Rise of Skywalker was.
Isaac predicts that Star Wars is going down the toilet.
I don't know if it's going down the toilet exactly, but it is, yeah, I don't know. There's only so much hope that you can have for like a brand that's owned by Disney.
Well, maybe next time another movie comes out, we will have A New Hope.
Oh my gosh. I knew you were going to say that.
Maybe so.
You never know.
I don't think that the next Star Wars is Star Wars. Like, I don't think that The Force Awakens or that whole sequel trilogy will carry the kind of cultural weight that the original Star Wars trilogy carried.
So you think it diminishes with each film, with each trilogy? It becomes less and less of that transcendent, like, regardless of the quality? I'm just, like, wondering where you're going with this.
I would think so, just simply because more and more of the attraction to it is based on what came before. At least the way these movies have been made so far. And again, maybe this could change if the film started to go in a route that challenged expectations and really did change fundamentally what Star Wars is. But I'm guessing that most of the ensuing movies are going to be like heroes' journeys told in somewhat similar ways about the battle of light versus dark. And there's only so much that you can do with that in terms of maintaining the kind of event status that leads to these movies having as much cultural weight as they have.
I think the further that we get away from the original trilogy, the more we ask ourselves, what is Star Wars? If you asked someone after they had watched the original trilogy and that's all there was, what Star Wars was, they would have given you like a much different answer, obviously, than what someone after they watched the prequels gave you, and so on and so forth in that fashion forever. I mean, there is like a literal distance from the original trilogy that will happen inevitably. And then I also think, to what you were saying, like there's going to be maybe a diminishing, just in the sense that you're getting further and further away from what was the original trilogy, like with every new movie you make. Unless they were to go completely in a different direction and go back somehow toward the original trilogy. But at this point, I think there's probably no way to do that. So my point stands.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, though, Rian Johnson is signed on still apparently to make his own Star Wars trilogy.
His own Star Wars trilogy?
His own Star Wars trilogy.
They should have just had to do a whole trilogy originally and not just a middle entry.
Yeah, probably so.
Like one way or the other. The whole thing or none of it until later. Yeah,
I think I agree.
Yeah.
So we'll see if he can redefine Star Wars, or I don't know what the current definition of Star Wars is. So
better than Cats.
There you go.
I didn't see it.
Hot takes by Cory.
Is that where we're gonna end it?
Well, I don't know. We'll be back when the next episode comes out. I guess.
This is part 1 of our 80-part series on Star Wars Legacy.
It's this ever-changing entity at this point, but it remains with some sort of an essence, like this beloved nostalgic thing that is driven by, I guess, the energy of, fantasy or sci-fi fantasy or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. It embarked on a journey, and it's still on that journey, so we have to just kind of see where it goes from here.
Yeah.
Yep.
We will see.
We will.
And that stuff's still coming. Mandalorian just got renewed for a second season, so...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's taking it in a new direction all by itself. A live-action TV show, Star Wars.
Right.
So
totally unprecedented.
Totally.
But
even though there's been MCU TV shows, I guess.
Right, yeah. I mean, like, it's interesting that Star Wars is self-defined enough that we consider it unprecedented to have a live-action Star Wars TV show, even though that is, like, such a safe bet, right?
Yeah. A TV spin-off of anything famous is almost guaranteed at this point nowadays. Yeah.
And yet Star Wars is still stands apart from the crowd enough that it has that these entries have that event status. But as they keep coming out, it's going to lose that event status.
Well, I guess to that point, very briefly, I'll say that I feel like what I think we're going to see more of, rather than maybe films, I think there will be films, is more of those one-off sort of limited series or movies like Rogue One or movies like Solo, where you kind of are building out the universe more and more. We're going to see more of that as opposed to just more movies, because I think what people want, at least to a certain extent, are things like the backstories, because we've been going on this journey for so long that things like what are the Mandalorians is interesting, and things like how did the rebels get the plans are interesting to people. So I feel like we're definitely going to see more of that.
Yeah, for better or worse. I mean, honestly, it's basically what they did in literary form following the original trilogy, so it's not even that unheard of, despite its unprecedented nature.
But also in literary form, following the original trilogy, there was the huge extended universe,
yeah,
right,
exactly,
that really has not been delved into cinematically at all.
And now is with The Mandalorian.
Starting to be. So maybe that's the one way that Star Wars can stay fresh. But again, there's more to staying fresh, I think, than just introducing new characters and new stories, right? It's about how you tell those stories and how you develop those characters. And if those methods continue to be so similar to the original trilogy, whose arc we still really haven't escaped from, then that will spell the death of Star Wars.
Isaac predicts the death of Star Wars coming soon to a theater near you. Okay. All right. I think that's a good spot to leave it. Don't know if we answered any questions, but we put some good stuff out there for sure. And I feel pretty good about it. Thoughts, Leslie? How was your first podcast episode?
That was great. Happy to be here. Happy to be a part of a Star Wars discussion anytime.
Maybe we should have never set out to answer any questions, because how can you possibly answer anything about something as expansive and universal as Star Wars?
Our efforts perhaps were futile, but that's okay.
Yeah. Yes. We tried.
It's
more than you can say, you listener.
All right. With that note, thanks for listening, and please subscribe. Check us out on YouTube, Instagram.
At About Movies CI.
Yes.
As our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram handle. So go give us a follow on there and subscribe to us.
Yes.
On our blog.
And unlike Ben, I will not self-promote any of my personal profiles, because that's not what it's about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Only
we will
us.
not be inviting Ben back ever again.
He is kicked out forever.
For good.
Okay.
Aboutmoviesci.wordpress.com, everybody, for the blog.
For the blog. Check out the blog.
And until next time,
Yep.
thanks for listening.
We just talked about movies.
Also, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
And
Yeah, we don't know how to end this.
written and directed by George Lucas.
Yes. Okay. Bye.